here. Good evening to you on behalf of the Calgary Climate Hub. I welcome you to A Climate of Change, our weekly live cast exploring with thought leaders from across Canada what this wildly unprecedented moment in history means for our province, this country, the economic system, and specifically the climate crisis. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina Nation, the Yaqsi Nakota Nations, the Métis Nation of Region 3, and all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. I'd like to make a second land acknowledgement on behalf of another group of folks that have a stake in this land that we stand on today, and that is our children, our nieces and nephews and grandchildren, and all future generations. I urge you to keep them in mind during this time as we face unprecedented change and start making decisions about what comes next. Before we begin, I want to thank our sponsor, Skyfire Energy. Skyfire has been designing and installing solar PV systems for homeowners, business owners, utilities, municipalities, and First Nations since 2001. They're an employee-owned, certified B Corporation with offices in Calgary, Edmonton, Penticton, and Regina. Their staff is one of the most experienced and qualified teams in the industry, having completed many of the largest and most complex solar projects in Western Canada. Their vision is to bring the magic of solar power to the world for a stronger, healthier, and more sustainable global community. We're glad to have you on board, Skyfire, and furthermore, Canada's going to need you in the time to come. Tonight's guest is Dr. Sara Hastings-Simon. Sara is a research fellow at the School of Public Policy, where her research is focused on low-carbon energy transitions at the intersections of policy, business, and technology. Sara is also, amongst many other things, she is a senior fellow at the Pembina Institute, where she leads the Business Renewable Centre Canada. You can read her op-eds in the Globe and Mail and the CBC, many of which lay out industries and opportunities that could make Alberta a winner in the transition to the future. Sara Hastings-Simon, welcome to A Climate of Change.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Great to have you. First up, I'd just like to get your lay of the land right now. Where are we? What does this moment mean?
Well, there's obviously a lot going on. And I like to separate kind of, there's the, before COVID time, there's the real sort of the health crisis that we're dealing with and the economic crisis that we're dealing with right now. And then looking ahead, there's that period of kind of recovery and rebuilding that we'll move into. And so, if you wind back to the clock before we started, sheltering in place and really doing our part to help the health of our country, we were in the midst of a pretty dramatic energy transition already, right? So we already had, obviously most recently, some of the significant increase in production from different oil producing countries, that was impacting supply and prices. But we had also a pretty massive shift in the energy systems more broadly, and that was really starting, continuing to pick up steam and continuing to grow. And so going into kind of where we are now, I think it's important to keep that in mind, right? So we're going to talk about energy transition. Obviously, there's a lot going on in the energy industry now as a result of the pandemic, but there was a lot going on before as well too. Where we are right now, obviously, we've seen quite a dramatic drop in demand for electricity and for oil. So we've gone down about, say, 30%, let's say, in the barrels demand now. And we are, this is a period of crisis, and it's not, yes, emissions are down as a result, but this is not the way that, we want to see the world tackle emissions going forward. It's not a blueprint for that, let's say. But coming out of it, we know that there will be a lot of investment from governments looking to stimulate the economy, looking to build new projects, looking to bring people back to work. And so I think coming out, we're going to see that forces of the energy transition that we saw going into this continue, and perhaps in some cases even be accelerated through, some of these infrastructure projects that are, have a climate target.
So, yeah, I agree with all of that. For the first time, I've never heard of anything going negative in price. like the negative oil thing. And I understand it's a little more complicated, and it was only a special set of circumstances for a day or so. But I'm not. I don't even know. I don't. I'm not an economist, so I'm not familiar of when that sort of thing has happened before. I guess I want to know, what does it mean for Calgary, the capital city of oil and gas in Canada, to have experienced negative oil, followed by a fast-growing global stockpile?
Yeah, so I mean, it's relatively unprecedented. I think my understanding is that truly negative prices like that have not happened before. As you said, I mean, it's sort of that's the price at which it was trading on the spot market, and there's a lot of caveats around that. But what it represents is just a very dramatic, swing within the oil markets, and a kind of, obviously that's coming from this dramatic decrease in demand, coupled with the increase in production that was already underway. What it is not so different, or what the oil industry has experienced before, is volatility, and the volatility, so these swings in prices up and down, is increasing, right? So this is obviously a very extreme form of that, but over the past couple of decades, we're seeing a lot more volatility than we've seen before, and so this is, you could see that as an extension, I guess, of that point. It's, I think it's impactful for the industry in Calgary. I think people are starting to kind of wrap their head around the idea that, yes, we've seen oil price declines previously, right? And that while in those cases, in kind of previous recessions within the city, things turned around when the prices started to rise, there's a growing number of, reasons that this time is looking a lot different. And so that is, the fact that we're starting to see, there's a growing kind of consensus that, pick exactly the year, but that, peak oil demand is coming. And that growing volatility, those things combined, make the kind of projects that Calgary, that Calgary companies pursue even harder to move forwards on, right? So, with the introduction of shale oil and some of these shorter term, smaller capital amounts projects, the projects in the oil sands that are large, they take a lot longer. It's a lot harder as an investor to wrap your head around making, a multi-decadal investment at this time. And so, I think it's what it means for us in Calgary is really, having to start to think more seriously about where does our future growth and future job increases come from? Because, obviously we're going to continue to be producing oil, but there's that distinction between producing from the existing projects that we have and new production, which is a lot of what's really driving, most of the job growth.
So just to stick with oil for a minute here, like you had mentioned, oil and gas in this province and globally have had a few hits, but specifically in this province, since about 2015, we just keep getting hit by global factor after global factor, from America becoming our number one competitor instead of our customer, to things like tech didn't want to build here, and to the Saudi and Russian oil games that get played that impacted us. Then we move it. All of that is before coronavirus. Then there's the coronavirus, and then there's this global stockpile. And I guess the question is, how soon can this province expect to rely on oil as our prime engine, and at what point can this province expect oil to come back in this province to the level that we can depend on it as we always have?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, so forecasts are hard, right? As the saying goes, especially about the future. There's sort of two different pieces, I think, in that question. So one is more of, when does when do we arrive in a sort of more normal post-COVID state and start to see demand kind of go back to maybe around where it was, and when do we start to see stockpiles going down? That is something that I think will happen, and that will return us to a point of the price is hard to predict, but somewhat more normal, but on the low side of price. The other question of, when do we get to the point where you start to have investors that are saying, okay, now I want to go and build the next big project. I think that's the point that we may, we're starting to realize we may never get back to again, right? And what we'll see is companies, working to become as lean as they can. So that means, more automation, trying to reduce the cost of production, and continuing again to produce from those assets that are already existing, but not necessarily making new investments. And so as an engine, yes, there continues to be that engine of production and of revenues and royalties that come from that. But the engine of new projects and that creating the job growth is really, I think, a lot, starting to become a lot less clear that we'll get back to that point.
Right. Okay, so moving to the moment and where we're at right now. I feel like, other than when will everything safely open up again, the prime question, certainly asked by the climate conscious worldwide, is, will COVID trigger a global low carbon transition? What are your thoughts on that?
So I think we'll see in some ways an impact there, right? So I think, one of the biggest question marks that I think nobody really knows the answer to is, how will it change individual behavior, right? So will, and kind of behavior that's related to companies. So will a lot of companies allow people to start working from home? Will people make longer term changes to the way that they are traveling or not flying, things like that? And there, I think there's, we don't really have an event previous like this to kind of point to. So I think it's really hard to say whether, people will kind of just go back exactly the way things there were before, or some of that will stick around. That's on the individual side. If you look at sort of more the energy system side, I think we know that there will certainly be spending coming out of the back end of this, whether it's a recession or depression, whatever ends up happening here, governments will be putting into place stimulus packages. And those, I think, can serve to accelerate transition. We certainly saw it, coming out of the 2008-2009 period in the US, where there was significant spending that really went a long way towards, driving down the costs of solar and wind and increasing deployment in those areas. It also had an important role to play in really stimulating the early electric vehicle market that's brought us here today, both in terms of actually, loans that went to Tesla that actually enabled them to build their first manufacturing facility, but also to kind of requirements that were made on some of the big auto manufacturers that if they were going to get bailout money from the US, they would have to take action there as well too. So there's some pretty recent examples of stimulus money going in that direction. I think the government in Canada has, certainly made its intentions and some of its early actions clear that, they have a net zero target for mid-century. And so, stimulus is going to have to somehow be consistent with that target if that's something that they're sticking with. Similarly, the European Union has made some pretty clear statements there. In the U.S., a little bit more uncertain at the federal level, depending on what happens with the election. But at the states level, obviously, a lot of states moving ahead on that. And so just as an example, one of the mechanisms that I think we could see kind of this period ending up accelerating transition is actually through pausing some of our large infrastructure investments that would have otherwise happened over the next couple of years. And for something like vehicles, for example, so, we know vehicle sales are down, people aren't buying cars. There's been a bit of a debate of, well, okay, electric car sales are going to go down because gas is cheap and because people aren't buying cars. But on the flip side, internal combustion engine car sales are down as well too. And so, there's certainly a scenario where we come out of this and you have a kind of big backlog of people who, we're waiting to make their vehicle purchase. And instead of making it, today, they're making it 2, 3, 4 years in the future, when they have a larger selection of electric vehicles, when the costs have come down some. and they may go straight to an electric vehicle when they otherwise would have bought a gasoline car. And so I think, similarly, that's an individual decision. Similarly, within the power sector, I think we're going to see a big pause on construction of new natural gas facilities. And as a result, then, see more renewables coming in than might have other in the short term to fill that in as well too. So, there, of course, there's this back and forth of, if energy is cheap, that's going to drive people's behavior to some extent. But some of that longer term kind of higher carbon infrastructure lock-in, I think may play more of a role there in the end.
You feel like it's sort of, looking back at this time, this will be the time that people in the future look back to, where some countries, where the winners and losers sort of choose themselves, because we do have to transition, and we don't have the option not to do it. And we'll certainly see that some jurisdictions are going to cling by their fingernails to the status quo, and others are going to see this as an opportunity. Does that jive with what you think it might happen globally?
Yeah, I think so. I think also different regions are better positioned to, transition. And for the challenges that a place like Alberta and Calgary has, for example, we also have a lot going for us, right? I think, when I can't sleep at night, my nightmare scenario is that we end up, like some of the coal communities in the US that have just been really, so hardly hit by the closures there, and are really struggling in a lot of ways, even more deeply than we are today in Alberta, is fair to say. But you look at kind of the makeup of those communities, and the fact that Alberta has, much more highly educated workforce, is somewhat more connected to just geographically global markets. And so I think there's a lot of reasons for optimism that, we don't necessarily have to have Calgary be, left out of that transition. I think we have a lot of kind of the skills and abilities that are needed. But certainly places, individual regions will struggle. And that's where, government really has a clear role to play in helping to, make sure that everybody within a country or community is able to kind of come out on the other side of this.
Yeah. So my feeling is that Canada and the Liberal Party under Prime Minister Trudeau, it seems like they're interested in, and have always been interested in, the transition. It's not an easy thing to do, and nobody can turn on a dime, but my read has been like, okay, as a climate advocate, I've always felt that, okay, there's a partner there. I don't feel like I have a partner at the provincial level, and I think that's probably understandable to many people. At the provincial level, I feel like there's an ideological opposition to anything other than just oil and gas. And so being here in Calgary, again, capital city of oil and gas, but a city with all sorts of opportunities and smart people and great education and expertise and science and all of that, I guess I'm trying to figure out what is, if this jurisdiction wants to shift, how are we going to have to go around our provincial leadership and partner with the feds? Is that how this works, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's hard to sort of be in the mind of the provincial government, and certainly, in recent days, there's been comments that have come out that are not at all encouraging, right, about kind of the idea of transition. That said, a couple months ago, there were comments made by the premier about, the need to think about, how Alberta kind of goes through a transition. So, I guess I still hold on to hope that, that we might manage to move forwards in a productive way. But I do think that, we do benefit, as you said, from the fact that there is a federal government that does, they have put in place this mid-century target, and they do have, an ability to support Alberta and Calgary through that transition. And in a way they have it, it's a bit easier, right? Like, there's a lot of there's a lot of work that people have done, understanding what drives so-called carbon lock-in. So, why is it so hard for economies to decarbonize? And certainly, the link between industry and political power and all these things are very hard to overcome. So, I think it's not unique that we have that challenge here in Alberta. But we do have, I think we do have a supportive federal government. And, I think there was, for example, the recent announcement that they made about the funding for methane reduction and for addressing the orphan and inactive wells, is a great example of the way that the feds can support the province, and in particular, really the workers and the people of the province through that transition. So, I think we'll kind of see where the chips land provincially, but as you say, I think it's good to see that we do have that partner there.
Yeah. So for when we're thinking about a transition, I was really, as I mentioned to you before, I was really struck by your article about the minerals that we have access to in this province and in this country to build the renewable technologies from batteries and solar panels. And it seems to me like when we're trying to figure out what this New Deal is for Alberta, then one of those things is to look at stuff like that. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about that opportunity.
Definitely. So there's a lot. I think one thing that's important to acknowledge is that, we're unlikely to find a single silver bullet where we say, okay, we can, pivot our entire economy and everybody that works in oil and gas is going to now work in this sector. I think we're going to end up with, if we're successful with an economy that has, a lot of different parts to it. And so things like technology, IT, there's a lot of role there as well. But that said, Alberta and Canada has a long history as a resource country. We have, to some extent, there's almost like a simple way to understand it, like we have a lot of space, so that we have a lot of land, and there's a lot of stuff in that land. And the energy transition is about using and meeting our needs. So if we look at something like mobility, for example, or electric power generation, we're still going to want to get around. We're still going to want to be able to, turn on our lights. So it's not that we're going to stop doing those things, but we're going to achieve them in ways that are lower carbon and often, quite different. So through renewable power, through electric vehicles. And those still require materials, right? So there's kind of a list of critical metals and materials. And this is starting to get a lot of attention, just over the past kind of months and even almost weeks, just given everything that's gone on globally and kind of people's concern about, how much global cooperation there will be coming out of the pandemic. But this idea that for a lot of those materials, so everything from lithium, cobalt, and others, the U.S., Canada, big parts of Europe are really quite reliant on China for those materials, and there are a number of people that are concerned about that, and there's a lot of work that's kind of starting to go on about how could we address that. And so Canada does have deposits of many of these so-called critical metals and minerals. And there are people that have been working, very hard for a number of years to try to make these things happen, but it's very hard to do without, kind of a broader set of support. But the idea would be that, Canada and Alberta, for example, could shift from being a provider of essentially mobility and power through our oil and gas resource to provide mobility and power through our metals and minerals resource. And, you could put hydrogen in there as well too. If we can, produce those materials in ways that are, environmentally responsible, that are responsible and, respecting the rights of the indigenous people to the land, really kind of raise the bar on the way that we are producing our resources and becoming a supplier of choice for those materials, I think is a huge opportunity, right? And that's where we can leverage a lot of the skills that we have from the engineering side, materials processing. If you think about Canada more broadly, around manufacturing as well, because you need to, produce these raw materials, but then you actually, need to get them to some stage along the value chain so that they can actually be, put into batteries, that kind of thing. And so there's huge opportunities there to really, take the skills that we have and look at the kind of adjacent areas from oil and gas.
So I just want to mention to our crowd or to our viewers that if you ask questions in the chat, we will be getting to them once we've gone through a little bit more Q&A here between me and Sara. And we also have a few guest panelists who will come up and ask a few questions as well. One of the things that I've talked to a few different groups that are talking about a Green New Deal in Alberta, and I personally use the phrase Alberta New Deal because we like to try to get that word. If the word green causes you trouble, then fine. Let's see you shoot down an Alberta New Deal. So in addition to the mining and the minerals, are there any other low-hanging fruit to you that Alberta could look to that can create jobs? And when I think about the sweet spot, I think the sweet spot is it's something that's going to create prosperity, it's going to create jobs, it's better for our health, and it's better for the CO2. And what having paid attention to sustainability for some time, it seems like a lot of times those solutions are a multiple level win, in that they usually end up being either cheaper to create or they're good for producing money, but then there's a sustainable value to them, etc. So are there solutions that you think would just be a dead simple, let's just do this for Alberta in addition to the minerals?
Yeah, I do. So I think that, in addition to what you're saying of kind of where you look for those opportunities, when I think about, what Alberta could do, kind of layering on that. So, what is the world going to need that we can produce, that we have somehow, as part of our economy today? And where do we have, in particular, some sort of competitive advantage or special skills such that, it's really going to happen here as opposed to somewhere else. And so in addition to the metals and minerals piece, I think agriculture is a huge piece, right? So, we know that there is a lot of work that still needs to be done to think about how we're going to feed the world in a sustainable way. We talk a lot about oil and gas, but Alberta obviously also has a really rich agricultural history and has done a lot of, really excellent work in agricultural technologies. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity there as well in, thinking about how to produce food, more sustainably and with less energy and resource use. So, also less input materials as well. And so being able to export that food and also being able to export that technology and that know-how, because that's really become quite a high-tech area, right? I think saw a video on Twitter the other day that was going around of a young woman in the cab of her, I think she was seeding a field or something, and she had quite an impressive number of screens on things going on. So really there's a lot of, quite a big market in that space. So that's one that I'm quite bullish on, I guess you could say. The other is around decarbonization of the industrial sector more broadly, right? So in a sense, there's been a lot of focus on how we decarbonize personal transport, how we decarbonize the electricity sector, obviously all very important, and continued effort is still needed there. But even more work is really needed around decarbonizing things like cement production, metal, iron, steel, all of the kind of heavy industrial production that uses a lot of high heat, quite a bit harder to decarbonize and really still, at the early stages of figuring out what the right way to do that is. And so again, I think, if you look at Alberta's skills, at Calgary's skills of building large projects and really those engineering skills that, that we, I think, have in a way that almost nowhere else in the world does, directing those towards that opportunity of industrial decarbonization as well. Another one where we can both, have an impact locally, but ultimately be able to, bring those technologies and know-how that's developed, around the world as well.
So I'm going to ask you what maybe sounds like a crazy question, but I feel like sometimes crazy questions get interesting answers. If we wanted to, and we set ourselves up, could Alberta feed all of Canada?
That's a good question. I don't know. I would have to do the quick back of the envelope, how much space we have and how much food you can grow per unit. But I think that we certainly, along with obviously our prairie neighbor, have really significant food production. And I think, but that's one where I think we would, again, there's both the piece of kind of what you're doing here from an agricultural perspective, but then also what you're doing to export some of those skills. I think one of the things that, is really, as I mentioned before, kind of up in the air coming out of this period and even going into it, there has been a bit of, I guess you'd call it like a backlash almost against globalization and a lot of questions around, what makes the most sense for supply chains for food. And I think there's a lot of interesting questions there. It's certainly not an area of expertise for me, but they're often very complex questions, right? Because it's not always true that producing food further away and transporting it takes more energy, right? It depends a lot on what that production looks like and what the transport looks like, because there's quite efficient ways to transport things and inefficient ways. So it's certainly a very interesting area to ask questions in.
Well, I can just tell you that when Prime Minister Trudeau first talked about shutting down the border to America, but they were still letting Americans in, I was sort of raising the red flag on Twitter because I was just like, hey, it's a pandemic, shut down the border. I don't want to, but the pushback that I was getting, even from the left, was, hey, look, we don't want to upset that guy. If he decides to turn off the taps and there goes all of our food and all this stuff. And so I feel like that might be a shift of the Overton window that when it comes to how we get our stuff, now that we're a little more cognizant of borders. I'm going to go, we've got a guest panelist ready to ask you a question.
Great.
He is in fact a colleague of yours. So I would imagine that Vincent is coming up here. Yeah, Vincent's just got to get his mic and camera. There we go. There's Vincent.
Hey, Vincent.
Hello.
Nice to see
you. Thanks for sharing all these thoughts with us tonight. My question for you is around, the government of Canada has that target to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Looking at the long term, what do you think should be Alberta's role in meeting that target?
Good question. I think we have a lot of roles to play, right? So I think both kind of locally, we have a big role to play in decarbonizing our electricity sector, as you and I have often talked about in the past. And I think we're well on our way to that, right? So, we have a lot of great wind and solar resources that are, starting to be used more and more in the province. So I think Alberta has a role to play in continuing to build out that low carbon electricity resource. And then I would couple that with really developing some of the solutions and technologies, and then producing some of the materials that Canada is going to need to get there. So some of that decarbonizing the industrial sector, the production of materials that say will go into batteries for electric vehicles and for transport. And then also, for example, if hydrogen ends up being, say, the way that some of the longer distance transport ends up going, I think Alberta can continue to play a big role in, just as we do today, in producing a lot of the resources that the country needs.
Did that get your question answered, Vincent? You're allowed to follow up if you'd like, because the Prime Minister, he gives a question and a follow-up. So I feel like if you want to follow up, you're welcome to have one.
Yeah, I guess, I guess on the electricity work, and I know you co-wrote an article with Blake Schaefer on that. Do you think it's building transmission lines between provinces is the right fit for as part of the green recovery? And I'm wondering in terms of like the planning that could delay some of these constructions to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think that transmission lines are important, right? I mean, I like to think about it as a little bit like a race between transmission line and more local storage. But we do have quite a kind of chopped up electricity grid across Canada. And so we would benefit quite a bit from increasing transmission capacity to British Columbia, for example, as well as down into the States. And there is, just being able to balance, and that's one of the things Blake and I talked about in that article. But one of, I think, the misconceptions about those transmission lines and that opportunity is the idea that this is something that benefits, only or primarily British Columbia, and that somehow, they're going to sell us expensive power and this is going to be so great for them and so not good for us. But actually, as we look to further electrification across the country, including in British Columbia, Alberta can produce a lot of electricity through our wind and solar resources at a price that's, it's sort of the cheapest new electricity resource that you can build out. And so there's a big opportunity for us here in Alberta too, in having those transmission lines and being able to export our power to BC as a source for them for electrification. So I would like to see those move forwards, and I think that there is, of course, there are real challenges around approvals and finding the right routes and those kinds of things. But I think as the experience really across North America shows that often the transmission line challenge is really more of a almost political one. And so, I think with the political will there and the view that, this is an important piece of getting to that net zero target, I think it is achievable.
Thanks for your question, Vincent. I should also mention that not only is he a colleague of Sara's from Pembina, but he's also a former Calgary Climate Hub board member and still a Calgary Climate Hub member. We're members for life, right, Vincent?
That's right.
So that's me giving a little pitch for the Calgary Climate Hub. So what I would say to anybody, if you're not a member yet, you should consider becoming a member, because it really does help to be able to go and work with people who are trying to move the ball and aren't just trying to talk and make noise, but actually working with the city and other organizations to try to get us to where we need to be on climate. So thank you, Vincent.
Great to
Up
see you,
next,
Sara.
we've
Thanks.
got
Good to see you too.
All right. Actually, Sara, can I ask you about your background there? What's going on with all the cars? I'm dying to know.
So the car, this was sort of the, like, in the first days where everybody was working from home, this was the space, and this is actually used to be my kids' room.
Okay.
And it kind of ended up as my background, and then I liked it. So I decided I would just go with it. So I like to joke that these are my electric vehicles. They are Scandinavian. This is a Scandinavian print, but you can tell because they have no tailpipes. So it's very, very appropriate for someone who thinks about energy transition.
I like it. That's wonderful. Okay, our next panelist, we're going to bring up Rose Jackson. And so Rose Jackson is one of the leaders of the Fridays for Future movement, climate youth movement. And whenever I can, I take the opportunity to mention that Rose and her teammates in the youth climate strike movement were out speaking truth to power at City Hall in minus 29-degree weather. Every Friday they could be out there. They were out there, and the only reason they're not out there now is because they're, like all climate activists, smart enough to socially distance ourselves properly. But anyways, Rose Jackson, thank you for coming on. And what's your question for Sara?
Just want to make sure, can everyone hear me?
Yeah. You're good.
Okay, perfect. So I kind of have like a two-part question. So just transition, we all know that we got to do it. What are your thoughts on the Green New Deal made for Alberta by Albertans that kind of emphasizes the transition for workers in terms of like skills and transitioning towards the green energy sector, climate change, education, and innovation, and would that be possible within the next few years?
Yeah, great question. And I mean, that's really the big challenge, and so critical that that the transition does, isn't leaving people behind and is creating more opportunities. And I would say that's both, thinking about kind of people that are, maybe will be, have say an attractive job today that may or may not be there after a transition, but actually also thinking about people who may be left out of the economy today. How can we use that transition as a way to bring more people in as well too, and to kind of address other underlying issues around equality. And so, this is an area I think that is, people are really aware that we need to work on it, and there is no silver bullet, simple answer. But the best approaches are sort of a combination of things, right? So one is that piece of kind of, for people that are really, say close to retirement, or for whatever reason, there isn't going to be a way for them to kind of find a space in that new economy. It's thinking about how do you support them and provide them with the early retirement funds or things like that are going to allow them to kind of come out of the transition okay. And then there's that middle tranche of sort of, retraining, right? So where can you find ways to help provide people with the skills to be able to, continue to do their work within that new economy piece. And that's where, the extent to which, say, we start to look into mining rare earths, there's a lot of complementary skills for people that are already, say, working in industry today. But certainly making sure that we're funding education and funding the right kind of technical upskilling type education is going to be key. And then for younger people that are still in school and kind of choosing their path, I think there's a big responsibility to show people that there is an opportunity here, and that's hard, right? Because for folks that have been in the industry or working for a long time, they kind of know maybe one way of making the economy in Alberta work. And so, certainly I think we do well to look beyond our borders and see, ways that, beyond our borders and also into our past, and see ways that, we've been able to kind of accept and find new pathways previously. But that's where that education piece is really critical. And then there's some things that are, beyond kind of, I would say, my area of expertise, but I find really interesting about that have been going on within this discussion around the state that we've been in with COVID and the attention that it's brought to the idea of, for a whole half of the population, for women in the population that are doing most of the caregiving work, how this is making us so aware of the fact that a lot of that work isn't being, maybe acknowledged and isn't being acknowledged financially. And so I think there's a lot of broader questions that we're going to come out of this with around how do we build sort of a more just economy more broadly. And I hope that, that carbon piece of the transition is one part of that. But I also hope that it's a chance to kind of look more holistically at some of those challenges we need to address.
Mm-hmm. And so for like a quick second question, how would you suggest like youth can effectively spark more conversations about the Green New Deal or sustainable development policy within like policymaker and governmental spheres? Just like any suggestions?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think, there's a lot that has been accomplished already, and so that's certainly something to be proud of that folks like you have done. I think using your, certainly for youth that are able to vote, definitely using your vote and getting all your friends to vote, because, I'm a big believer in that a lot of this stuff comes ultimately through policy change. It may not start there, but that's a critical piece of that. So having governments that are, going to put those types of policies into place are key. I think also, the kind of demand that you have for, for programs within schools, that gets people's attention too. I know that at the universities across Alberta, there's been a real shift away from an interest in some of the more oil and gas type majors. And I think that is making people kind of aware that, okay, there actually really is going to be a shift here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Okay, thank you, Rose, and keep up the great work. I know you will. I guess, let me see, we have one more panelist that will be loading up, but in the meantime, I have a question from Stephen Harding, who's one of our excellent volunteers. He's done a lot of great work helping me with our Community Climate Conversations initiative. He wants to know, does Alberta have enough solar and wind potential to replace fossil fuels for all electrical generation? And if not, what else can we do to clean the grid?
Great question. So, I mean, certainly on a pure kind of megawatt production basis, we do. I mean, we have a lot of space and we have pretty good resources. Of course, the challenge becomes then producing the power at the time that you need it. And that obviously adds some additional challenges. But generally speaking, greening or the grid, reducing carbon from electricity production will be a combination of those things. So we definitely need to ramp up pretty dramatically, and we are, taking first steps there. The amount of wind and solar we're producing. Then we need to get those transmission lines in place that will allow us to balance that power, so to send power to places, especially those that have a lot of hydro when we don't need it, and take it back when we do. There'll be then also some storage pieces that come into play there, and that's everything from that shorter term storage like batteries, also longer term. People are looking at all kinds of new technologies around old is new, heat storage, right? So basically making something hot and keeping it that way. And then also on the demand side, the demand management side too. So historically, energy production was all about, or electricity production was all about producing to meet demand. Going forward, it's going to be increasingly about matching demand to the times of use. So, and that's a whole suite of things, of finding ways to shift demand where, it might be possible, for example, if you have an electric vehicle, to be charging that overnight, down to, managing the way that our heating and cooling systems come on in a more kind of, what's the word? In a way that's more controlled, so that we are able to manage those peaks or spikes in demand. And so decarbonizing power, I think that's something that we're really, yes, we do want to continue to see improvements in storage, but we have a pretty good pathway to get there. And it's really a matter of getting those, kind of getting that target in place and starting to do the hard work of getting there.
Okay, sounds good. I guess I was hoping we have Devin up for our as our panelist. I don't see him up yet. And we have got a number of questions here. I feel like we may end up transcribing some of them and asking you via Twitter over the next few days. Is that something you'd be hip to?
Yeah, sounds good.
That'll be a new thing.
I spend a lot of time on there.
Yeah, me too. Too much.
Yeah.
Let me see. I will ask another question. We do know. I'm hearing that Devin is here, so let's let her back. But in the meantime, as we wait, I will. I may go to another one of our attendees, an anonymous attendee in this case, is asking for your position on the orphan well situation. I think we sort of talked about that a little bit, but that generally it's a positive thing that we're taking care of it. It maybe we'd like it if we didn't have to, and if the oil companies had taken care of it themselves. But you're positive about that choice.
So I think it's good. I think there's two pieces, like to everything, there's two pieces to that. So, I mean, There's the situation that we're in now, where there are orphan wells that, need to be addressed, and inactive wells that also, are basically at risk of becoming orphans. And so I think it makes sense to address those. At the same time, what we do need to see, and what was sort of promised with the money, but we haven't seen the details of, is a change in the regulations that got us there in the first place, right? So there are ways to, basically do things like require bonding, so companies are putting money up earlier on, also actually just not allowing companies to keep wells as inactive for very long periods of time, because that sort of increases the risk that they eventually become orphaned. So, we should fix the mess that there is, but we should make changes so that we don't end up in this situation again.
And it looks like we have Devin here. Let's go, Devin.
Hey guys, sorry about that. I had to switch on to my phone. My Wi-Fi wasn't quite working. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks so much for joining us. So I have a bit of a longer question. So specifically Calgary, like you said, has this perfect synergy of a highly educated population. We have a wealth of existing energy infrastructure. And then on the flip side, we have a younger population that's leaving because we're not taking advantage of these things. I started off with a general question of how can we kind of leverage these things that we have to make this transition to technologies like geothermal heat and energy and the methane or hydrogen from methane production that you talked about. How can we become the Silicon Valley kind of energy? It's kind of what I thought about. Like, why is that not happening yet? Was my first question. So.
Yeah, great question. I mean, so there is there's a lot of opportunity for sure, but there are also a lot of barriers, right? So, and I mean, I guess even just more fundamentally, like when you think about building up essentially a new industry, you need to have the idea. It needs to be, there needs to be a business case there, but you also need to have investors and people that, see that as an opportunity. And so historically, and in almost every example that we can look at, and even in our own backyard, in the case of the oil sands, what really started off that industry was some pretty significant government investment and kind of government showing that this could work, and then investors come in on the back end of that. And so since you mentioned Silicon Valley, people have for many years talked about, well, why can't we get more of the venture capital model that, is what has proven somewhat successful for, a lot of the tech companies into some of these, more like infrastructure and chemicals and oil and gas and energy space. And it's quite hard, right? That model for a lot of different reasons, but, one of which just like the scale of funding that's required and the time scales isn't necessarily a good match. And so there's really, a pretty significant role for government to play in kind of kickstarting these industries. And so that's where, I think I think is one of the big things to have happen. I mean, obviously you need entrepreneurs that are bringing forward these ideas and that are willing to work towards it, but it's a long uphill road if you don't get some kind of support in bringing these projects and these new ideas, kind of at least proving them out and bringing them to the market ready to invest in.
Okay. And then to follow up with that, say in a year from now, let's hope that the coronavirus is ending, and say that we don't get all the stimulus money that we're hoping for, and we're sitting where we are in a year. What's something that, for example, the Calgary Climate Hub could do to bring the ball forward a year from now?
Great question.
Excellent question. Yeah, I mean, I think, municipalities and the city have a big role to play, right? And so Calgary, has a lot that it can do, I think, to have an impact. Everything from, from its own energy production and consumption with NMAX, but procurement processes are a pretty powerful way of starting to drive innovation. And so making sure that, generally speaking, government procurement is pretty risk adverse, and for good reasons, right? You want to make sure that when you're spending public money, you're not taking big risks and you're getting, good value and trustworthy things for your money. But that said, sometimes that can lead to procurement approaches that are sort of focused on always buying, yesterday's technology because for sure that works. And so, certainly there's municipalities that have flexed that kind of procurement arm to look at greening up their own operations beyond even the electricity piece, which then also helps to provide that pull and create opportunities for businesses, and also signal more broadly to the investment community that this is a place that is going to be fruitful for doing that kind of work. So I think definitely working with the municipal government to find those opportunities where they can make procurement decisions or other investment decisions that are going to be cost savings, but then also thinking about those other benefits.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you very much, Devin. Devin is a Calgary Climate Hub board member and has also been a Climate Hub member on its own as well, and part of the fight for climate in this city. Thanks for participating, Devin.
See you guys.
I feel like we've been peppering you pretty fast and hard with questions there, Dr. Sara Hastings-Simon. I think I may ask you just one more question here, and then we'll let you off the hook. Although a lot of these have been sort of answered already through the process of the evening. I have another one of my Climate Hub cohorts asking me for a quick definition of ethical oil.
Well, I mean, there's a whole history around that, right? So I think it's sort of this idea of producing oil at a higher kind of standard in some dimensions. I think there's a lot of question about, how it seems to leave out, for example, the piece about the climate impacts. And it also, increasingly, I think is, as the world is kind of wrapping its head around this, whether it's 2050 or whatever year, but this need to get to this net zero time, the case for that, I think, becomes even harder to make, because at the end of the day, if you're making a product which is, one of its main purposes is to be combusted, it's hard to see that being compatible with where we're going. So, I kind of feel like it was an idea that maybe had its time back in the day, or people were trying to push, but I don't really see it going forward.
It sounds like it's mainly a branding thing at this point, that they try to, it's a message that they'd like us to pick up. But okay, well, I want to thank you very much for coming onto the show here and for taking all these questions. As I said, I think we'll transcribe whatever we didn't get to tonight and see if we can't get some answers from you on Twitter. But I certainly feel like I got a lot out of this, and a lot of those questions that I was asking you, I ask myself all the time. So you did a great job, and I want to thank you very much.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me. And I think you guys are doing great work. I mean, we need voices that people are going to listen to, and people asking for these kinds of things. So it's important.
Thank you, Sara. I'm going to do something new this week. I'm going to have some closing thoughts, and maybe it's something I'll be doing every week. We'll see how it plays. We'll see what the board says. This particular closing thought is to my fellow climate activists, champions, and organizations. Just because so many of us have anticipated for some time this type of system-wide crash doesn't mean it's not shocking to us. Many of us are taking a minute, getting our heads around it. And yes, we're Netflixing and chilling, taking care of our kids. We're not made of stone, so take your time, but don't take too long. Because for the first time ever, the goal of every climate conscious person, every advocate, every organization is exactly the same, no matter where on earth you live. Because whatever we choose to call it, a huge rebuild is coming. A jobs program, a stimulus, and none of us can count on even the best of our governments to get it exactly right. They need our help. They need our pressure, because our people have been thinking about this for decades. So when your head is right, the kids are taking a nap, shake the Cheeto dust off your chest and get back to work with us. We need you now more than ever. So that was this week's A Climate of Change. Next week's guest is Simon Fraser University Professor of Sustainable Energy and author of the Citizen's Guide to Climate Success, Professor Mark Jaccard. If you want to participate in the Zoom broadcast, be sure to sign up for a Hub membership between now and then. If you liked this A Climate of Change Thursday night broadcast, we want you to know once again that it wouldn't be possible without our excellent sponsor, Skyfire Energy. They paved the way for solar in Western Canada and are cutting a path to the future. And as I mentioned in the beginning of this broadcast, Canada's going to need your expertise, Skyfire. I'm certain of it. I want to thanks again to the Calgary Climate Hub and remind you that we are always looking for volunteers. We're doing a number of different interesting initiatives, including trying to pull together what a green stimulus plan looks like, an Alberta New Deal, etc. There's a number of things that we're doing. And if you ever feel the anxiety that I feel when the smoke rolls in or anything like that, I can only tell you personally that the thing that takes that away is talking with others and making things happen. So consider joining the Calgary Climate Hub. And if you can't because you're too busy, but you got a few extra bucks, we'll take some donations. Beyond that, I just want to thank the volunteers who helped this event happen tonight. So Shay Rogers, who's my production manager, as well as Joan Lawrence, who does a lot of work in the background. I would say co-production if we're giving out titles. And then, well, my good buddy Paulie just hooked me up with a microphone so you can all hear me and I don't sound stupid anymore, or sound less stupid. So once again, thank you for coming. Let's get to work.